The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
Welcome back to the Alexander Schmid Podcast, episode 027. This is Homer's Iliad, Book 8, Part 1. Last time we were talking about Book 7, we illustrated a one-on-one combat between Hector and Aias the Greater. Went favorably to Aias the Greater's advantage. It went towards Aias the Greater, it seemed like. He was dictating the action against Hector. However, the heralds from both the Achaeans and the Trojans, Idaeus and Talthybius, end up breaking up the fight because both men appear to be equal before the gods and because night is falling. And why does night end the battle? Well, for one, it's customary, and for two, because at night at that time, they didn't have huge spotlights or electricity, and so it could be very difficult to see, and therefore if one defeated one in battle, it was a different sort of defeat, and less of an honorable defeat, which will actually be brought up by Aias the Greater in his speech contest against Odysseus for the arms of Achilles later on. Odysseus will be accused of slinking in the night in order to kill all his foes, and you'll see why he says that in Book 10 in the Dolaneia. So, also we got to see the respective Trojan and Achaean camps. We saw that the Trojan camp is not doing so hot. Paris of Troy selfishly refuses to give back Helen of Sparta, of Argos, and instead, selfishly, again, offers to give back Menelaus' possessions. Obviously, there's a slap in the face of the Achaeans, and in council, Diomedes speaks up, voicing the will of the people, saying, absolutely not will we accept such a slap in the face, which shows not only that Diomedes speaks for the people, but that the people are re-heartened, you might say, after being disheartened in Book 2. They're willing to fight, even though they're given an out, and so that's important to note. The next thing you note is that Nestor is speaking in council, which is good for Agamemnon, and Agamemnon is allowing Diomedes to speak up against the will of the Trojans, meaning that Agamemnon is letting the people speak through him and is listening to them and is starting to embody that which a good leader embodies. And you might say that conflict is bringing the best out of Agamemnon at this moment. Though he was immediately disheartened in Book 2, he's regained his composure with a little bit of experience. And so he's showing that he's maturing alongside of Diomedes. That brings me to my next point. Something mentioned earlier, or part of the hypothesis of this course is that Odysseus is the human embodiment of Athena, and that he, like Athena, represents the stabilizing force of order, or rather, the force of wisdom to stabilize order, and that is why Athena, who represents wisdom, is the embodied form of the mind or will of Zeus. That's why she jumps out of his head. And Zeus is the principle of order, the entire order, which will be emphasized today at the beginning of Book 8, by the fact that he can hold down a golden rope and all the gods can pull on it and he can pull all of them, which, and they will not pull him anywhere. He will pull them and sky or earth and sea. And what does that mean? Well, without him, there's what? Just chaos. Exactly. The primordial chaos, and that's also why earth and sea disappear. The distinctions between things, which is sort of what the postmodernists are attempting to do right now. So Odysseus represents the stabilizing force of the human intellect or wisdom, what Athena is embodied on earth. However, Athena, we know, also loves Diomedes. And in fact, in the Inferno in Canto 26, Diomedes and Ulysses, he'll be called there, based on his Latin name, Odysseus, will share a dual-tipped flame. And so I spent a moment thinking about what it might mean to think that Diomedes and Odysseus, who often are paired together, they'll be paired together in the taking of the Palladium, they'll be paired together by legend also in the getting Achilles' son Neoptolemus to fight in the stories that surround the Trojan War that largely feature moments after Achilles' death when the Trojans, or when the Achaeans truly have to rely on their cunning over simply their strength, suggesting that when strength runs short, then cunning will supply the rest. And so Diomedes, though he does speak well and is clever, represents a different aspect of Athena, which is this. I believe he represents the capacity to climb the dominance hierarchy rather than to maintain the stability of order in the dominance hierarchy. So what is it that we see Diomedes doing? Well, acquiring new abilities, the ability to see the gods for a brief amount of time, and we see him not only starting to excel at battle at a level far beyond his peers, being able to actually directly attack gods, for example, but also, which means to master his own affect, one might say. His own, so Aphrodite represents sort of lust, or not simply lust, but also the human desire for reproduction in that system. And Ares represents aggression and the aggression system. And the Jungians represent this as the aggression being the shadow that a person has, and the sort of lust being represented, at least in a man, by the anima figure. So it's a very common idea all throughout history. And so what Diomedes is doing by being able to attack these gods is he's integrating these capacities into himself and therefore ordering himself better so that he can rise. And so now he not only fights at another level and fights higher level champions, and in fact will try to fight Hector today and will nearly kill him. And so what he is showing, and he'll actually throw a spear that almost hits Hector, hits his charioteer, indicating that he is zoning in on his target, which is how one rises, by making smaller and smaller mistakes and error correcting each time in order to have a smaller and smaller spread as one aims towards the goal. And so you can use an archery analogy for that. The truly great master may not hit the very dead center of the bullseye every time, but the spread will be tiny, and each shot will be very close. And that's what Diomedes is showing the capacity to do. And so Odysseus represents the capacity to maintain that order and to adapt to situations incredibly, or as effectively as possible. But Diomedes shows the dual-natured aspect, or the second aspect of being able to therefore climb a dominance hierarchy by virtue of this awareness and this error-correcting ability, which awareness or alertness indicates. And alertness will be a major feature of the Achaean success. In fact, in Book 9, when the Achaeans are very much dispirited, Nestor will go and take a look at the sentries, who are named for their sentinel nature, for their sensing nature, they're seeing things, and he will note that they are very alert, and that this means good things for the army. And so let's dive into Book 8 proper. It begins with an assembly of the gods, where Zeus has assembled all gods to listen to him. And so what does he do? He says, "It has now become expedient to me to ban you all from the battlefield, because I now know what fate decrees, the fall of Troy. And since I best know the mind of fate, or the will of fate," you might say that Zeus is the will of fate, and is the will of fate, and that he is the mind of fate, and that he understands what fate's will is, and also understands the way in which fate wishes to embody that will. And then often Athena will embody that will at the next level of abstraction down, and often Odysseus or some major champion will embody that down on the level of humans, making a direct line from the absolute will as divine, as Dante would call it, down to the human relative contingent will, which actually creates a transcendent morality, by the way. And so back to the notion of a transcendent morality, Zeus says, "And if any of you gods wish to go against my will," which is of course the will of fate, which is of course what is going to happen, "remember this. Were I to drop a golden rope from me all the way down to the earth, and we had a divine tug of war, all of you, versus me, you couldn't budge me an inch." What does that mean? Well, if Zeus is the principle of order, no amount of conflict between all the gods amongst each other or against the fact of that order is going to make that order disappear. And you might even say that that's a difficulty that the postmodernists are running into too today. The fact that there is order and that competence is that which dictates it in almost every dominance hierarchy, well, no matter how much you argue, that's simply going to be true. You want your great teachers teaching students. You want fantastic surgeons doing surgery. You want very dutiful and conscientious nurses working on people's bodies, and very conscientious and often scrupulous lawyers working on your legal documentation. The fact of the matter is, no matter, even if one believes that words can be used in any way, then that simply means that words aren't always used to describe the facts of the world. And not simply the facts of the world, but maybe the truths that have always existed that perhaps people can't define rigidly and finely, because the concepts or the realities of things are far more detailed than words can possibly describe. If an image is worth 1,000 words, then something real is worth infinite words, which we truly know. And so nothing one can possibly do could possibly remove the existence of Zeus. And if you ever listen to, say, the work of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, you'll hear that we have a common ancestor with the lobster from over 100 million years ago, and that even lobsters have their moods governed by serotonin just as we do, which affects posture, for example. And that we share, and so if a dominant lobster wins, he gets a serotonin boost. If the other lobster comes and the master-slave dialectic playing out amongst lobsters loses, it loses some serotonin, and its posture gets weak, and it won't fight for something like 20 minutes. And so we share a common ancestor with them, and so the dominance hierarchy is older than humans are. And Peterson even says it's older than trees, which is a good way to conceptualize something that's so older than time, essentially, that will never stop existing. And that is what Zeus defends. And so, he says, were he, however, to pull from his end, which would be essentially if he abandoned his duty to fate, that it would throw everything into chaos. He would pull up all the gods and the earth and the sea. And what does that mean? He would pull everything into oblivion, into chaos, into indistinct, formless nothingness. Because without order, without some binding force which gives structure to being, there can be no being. In fact, that's most likely why the duality of being and non-being actually exists, and the duality of absolute will and relative will. There must be something at all times consistent in order to see the fluctuations and demarcations of that which is truly creative and moves. In fact, that's a common theme one often sees even in philosophy. Fundamental divisions made like that, like form and matter in Aristotle. The world of the forms as well as the world that is judged by the forms, our world, for Plato, etc. Also, heaven and earth, of course, at the beginning of the Old Testament. So, in order for anything to be, two things need to be, apparently. And, in fact, I have some ideas on the Trinity, too, which I'll share during actually, they're based on Dante's ideas, which I'll share during the Divine Comedy, which is that after one, then two, then three, when something happens a third time, then it sets a pattern, and that's part of the aspect or the idea of the Trinity, that you know something is a one real thing when it's been done in action three times. And so, something embodied three times equals one concept. And it's interesting because one might ask, don't we make lists in threes most likely? It's like, yes, that's you illustrating often three instances of what is a thought. And what does that mean exactly? It means when you can list three instances of something happened that are connected in the same way, then you are revealing the existence of an underlying or overarching thought. Which is interesting because it means that thought actually does reveal itself through your experiences and through your awareness of what has happened in them. So if Zeus pulls, everything goes to chaos. And all the gods shudder in fear at this. And in fact, Athena, she's sullen at hearing this, and Hera, she's rather upset. But the gods indicate that they understand this and they assent to his will. However, Hera will try to contravene his will 2 times in this book, and several other times down the road. So, particularly between books 12 and 14. So, battle breaks out again, and Zeus busts out his golden scales. And so we'll see these golden scales again in book 16. But what this shows is that during a battle, often it says that the war god rages on and favors no one, which means Ares is conflict. Anybody can die by chance. True. Well, Zeus represents the opposite tendency of this, that team, that group of individuals who is best ordered in some day will be fated to win. And in fact, who's going to be fated to win this day? It's the Trojans. But why are they fated to win? Is it simply because they're better ordered? Not necessarily. It's because Achilles has willed them to do better through Zeus, which might mean that the resentment of Achilles has spread so far and has created such a rift and conflict in the Achaeans that now the Trojans actually have better unity than do the Achaeans. Even though the Achaeans seem to have new resolve to fight, and the Trojans likely have leftover resentment from Paris not giving back Helen yet again. And so it's a difficult situation to explain. However, today, for the first time, the Achaeans are going to lose. And so Agamemnon is going to have to deal with losing, and books 9 and 10 are going to be a major reaction against that when he sends an embassy to Achilles. So if you've been wondering for Achilles or wondering where he is, we'll see him again next book in the next couple lectures. And then if you've been wondering about whether any spying ever happens, people going out into the night, 007 style, with fewer martinis, well, we'll see that in book 10 with Diomedes and Odysseus. And so the Achaean death day weighs heavier on the golden scales of Zeus. And so he crashes some thunder, and this is a portent indicating his will and indicating that he favors the Trojans. And the major Achaean champions, and it's interesting that they notice, suggesting that all of them are a little more alert than the enlisted men. Well, Idomeneus, the Iontes, they all scatter, and in fact Odysseus is going to scatter too, and very interestingly, Diomedes calls to Odysseus, and Odysseus scatters while Diomedes stays, which perhaps indicates, if we consider the duality elucidated earlier, that the stability of the situation has broken down, but even though the stability is gone, the capacity to climb the dominance hierarchy remains, but not for very long, because Diomedes will get out of there. And so, Odysseus flies by Diomedes. So perhaps we won't judge Hector quite so harshly when we hear about him flying by Sarpedon or leaving his men on the pikes. Or perhaps we will. And so, Nestor's horse is hit in the brains, and which is it's described as in the brains, by either an arrow or a spear by Alexandros. I can't recall exactly which. It was an arrow. And so the horse of Nestor goes down, and he cuts it off the rein. However, now he's stuck. He can't move. And Hector is coming in and wants to kill him. He understands what a big, major kill this will be to kill Nestor. And so Nestor needs help. And who's there to help him? It's Diomedes. Diomedes pulls him into his chariot, and it's Nestor's lucky day. And it's sort of a funny moment when Diomedes invites Nestor in, because he's sort of bragging to the old man. The first thing he mentions is, come see how good these Trojan horses know the plain. And so why does he have Trojan horses? Because recall, when he injured Aeneas, he had Sthenelus take Aeneas' really nice horses, which, remember, were bred from some immortal stock that were stolen from some of Priam's horses. And so he's got some really nice horses. So he's essentially like, hey, look at my ride, old man. And then the next thing is, he seems to have been moved by Nestor's speeches about bravery, because what he says is, come then, climb into my chariot. This is 105, book 8, 105 to 111. What the Trojan horses are like, how they understand their plain and how to traverse it, in rapid pursuit and withdrawal. Horses I took away from Aeneas, who strikes men to terror. Let the henchmen look after your horses now, while we two steer these against the Trojans' breaker of horses, so Hector even may know if my spear also rages in my hand's grip. So he's not going to retreat at all. He's actually going to take Nestor into the fray, and he's going to take aim immediately at Hector, and he throws his spear at him, but he strikes only the charioteer of Hector, which is a common trope. Enopius is the name of the man with Hector. And so what does this mean exactly? Well, when a champion comes near to killing another champion, this often means something along the lines of his aim is closing in and he is improving as a fighter. Though sometimes it also indicates that he is having an off day if it happens over and over again, as Pandaros suggests, with his anger carried out at his bow, which he swears, cut off my head if I don't break this bow, which is kind of a funny thing to say. And so, the problem, though, is that Diomedes has attempted to kill Hector, has come very close, and now he doesn't realize that his luck is about to run out. So Zeus throws down a thunderbolt that throws up sulfur right in front of the chariot of Diomedes. Nestor sees this as a clear sign to retreat. And one might understand this as, Nestor sees a clear sign to retreat that Diomedes does not, because Diomedes is young and trying to push his luck in this situation by fighting alone against Hector when all the men are retreating. Nestor can see that this is a disequilibrated state, that this is not going to work as a strategy, and so he says, son of Tydeus, steer now to flight your single-footed horses? Can you not see that the power of Zeus no longer is with you? And so, if Odysseus is left a situation which is the principle which maintains order, then the principle which attempts to climb that order is not going to have anything to climb and therefore needs to get out of there. And so Diomedes has got to bolt. And so Diomedes says, yeah, okay, I'll leave. But gosh, I wish that worse than anything would be to hear Hector claim that I was running away from him out of fear. And so, and that's interesting because it shows that the Greek or the Achaean idea of immortality is what is said of one after one dies, which is very similar to our idea, which is also why we, of course, have epitaphs on tombstones, which is to inscribe something on stone, which means eternally, essentially. Well, Nestor gives the best response ever. Me, son of brave Tydeus, 152 to 156. What a thing to have spoken. If Hector calls you a coward and a man of no strength, then the Trojans and Dardanians will never believe him. Nor will the wives of the high-hearted Trojan warriors, they whose husbands you hurled in the dust in the pride of their manhood. Snap! Boom! Wow. Nestor really, nail on the head right there. He says, for one, nobody on either side will believe that, for sure. And for two, definitely not the women who were the wives of the men you've killed. They won't believe that. Not ever. No one can say anything about your name, Diomedes. Which is interesting because that's essentially wisdom speaking straight to Diomedes' heart, saying, you've done enough today. Let's go back for now. You have to keep fighting. Dying right now will do nothing to help your glory and everything to help his. And so, Diomedes turns to flight, not to fight, and Hector calls out in a great voice at him and claims that he'll never carry the women of Troy back with him home if he has a say in it, and well, he will not have a say in it ultimately. And so, Hera then tries to rouse Poseidon, and this is such an interesting interlude because it's only a few lines long, and she tries to get Poseidon to intervene on behalf of the Achaeans, and he just straight up says no to her. He essentially just affirms what Zeus said earlier. 208 to 211, he says, Hera, reckless of words, so similar to Thersites there and Eurylochus later in the Odyssey. What sort of thing have you spoken? I would not be willing that all the rest of us fight with Zeus, the son of Kronos, since he is so much the greater. And so if we're representing Poseidon, the embodiment of the order of Zeus on earth and sea, then it makes sense that he would remain consistent with Zeus. And it also makes sense that Hera would be able to communicate with him, since that's essentially her communicating with Zeus on a slightly different level. Perhaps she can understand him better in that way. But Poseidon says no. And so now we have a very interesting moment. Agamemnon then lines up on the middle ship of all the Achaeans. And who's in the middle of the ships? Well, the person who was in the middle of the catalog of ships, who has the sides of his ships painted red. That's Odysseus. So Agamemnon speaks from a place of intelligence, the middle of the pack, where Odysseus keeps his ship. It's not where the most reckless, because strongest men keep theirs, Aias the Greater, for one, who has his ships closest to the wall, besides Protesilaus, who's now dead, who was the first man who died at Troy. Near the wall of the Achaeans, Achilles also has his ships on the other side, the diametrically opposed side of the shore, indicating that they both are at the extremes and they're reckless because of their strength. But where's Odysseus? He's in the middle. What's the middle? It's the safest place. Where is it the safest place? For anything, essentially, except for in a fire, one might say, but within a zebra pack, safest from lions, and within a school of fish like cod, for example. The middle is the best place to be, and so Odysseus is in the wisest possible place, and therefore when Agamemnon speaks in front of Odysseus' ship, he speaks from a wise place. And he speaks in a piercing cry, it says. And he reminds the men of their strength and the claims they've made and the good food they've been eating and the good wine they've had and all the sacrifice they've made for this time. And he says, let our men at least get clear and escape, and let not the Achaeans be thus beaten down at the hands of the Trojans. And he spoke thus, and as he wept, the father took pity upon him and bent his head that the people should stay alive and not perish. Straightway he sent down the most lordly of birds, an eagle. So note that an eagle has always been a symbol for kingly authority, whether it be here, whether it be for the Romans, whether it be for Justinian, represented as a Byzantine Roman in Dante, or whether it be the eagle of the United States. It's a symbol of maximal perspective and predatory ability, and therefore power. So he sends down an eagle holding a fawn, the young of the running deer, caught in his talons, who cast down the fawn beside Zeus' splendid altar, where the Achaeans wrought their devotions to Zeus of the voices. So what does this indicate? That Agamemnon has spoken with great emotion. He's spoken from the heart. And what has he done to the people? Well, he's swayed the people. And not only the people, but Zeus of the voices. What does Zeus of the voices mean? It means the leader's ability to listen to that, or to give the people what they want in order to persuade them. The leader's ability to embody the voices of his people. It's essentially a democratic idea, and Zeus represents that too. So Agamemnon has completely hit a chord with his people in this moment. And so he is more and more embodying the ideal leader, and more doing this under adverse circumstances. So excellent work on his part. Unfortunately, it will not last, because perhaps it will depend on how we interpret that in the moment, because in Book 9 and Book 10 it will seem as if he is getting more and more desperate, but perhaps that's because the situation is getting more and more desperate and he simply reflects it. And so an interesting question would be, is it a duty's leader not to reflect a desperate situation under desperate times? And I would say that Hector often represents that situation with great nobility, though not at all times, because he, like Peter, right before the death of Jesus, messing up a few times, well, right before his own death, he will also show some elements of cowardice, and we'll have to really think about what that means, because it will be shocking to see what happens right before he fights Achilles. And so after the speech by Agamemnon, he rouses 9 Achaean champions to fight. Again, we see the theme of 9 and champions, and it's several of the ones that we hope to see. So it's both the Atreidae, Menelaus and Agamemnon. Agamemnon has pumped himself up. The 2 Iontes, Idomeneus, and of course his henchman Meriones, Eurypylus, Teukros as well, and alongside Aias. And so Teukros is an archer who's the half-brother of Aias and is the bastard son of Telamon. And he has an interesting story. And in fact, after Aias dies, Teukros will be banished from his home in Salamis, because actually his father will blame him for not keeping Aias alive, which is something that Teukros will actually bring up being afraid of in Sophocles' Ajax, which we'll go over at some point. And so Teukros is now going to have his aristeia. What is his aristeia? Well, he's going to shoot dead something like 8 people. Orsilochus, Ormenos, Ophelestes, Ditor, Chromius, Lycophontes, Amopaon, and Melanopus. And, essentially, Hector, if one has seen those old box fighting games in arcades, and ever heard that automated voice that says, "Combo breaker," that's what Hector's going to do here. He's going to put a real stop to Teukros' killing. And in fact, it's going to be due to some avarice and fighting spirit of Teukros, because Teukros is going to see his chance to take his shot at Hector and bravely attempt it. But as he's pulling his bowstring back to his ear, Hector has pulled up a rock and thrown it and takes Teukros in the collarbone. But lucky for him, Aias the Greater is his half-brother and will defend him and help take him off the battlefield, or defend him until he is taken off the battlefield, because Aias is a major part of the Achaean front now, and he is called the Wall of Achaeans for good reason. And so, sorry to end this episode on sort of an Empire Strikes Back note with the bad guys, the Trojans, if you do identify them as the bad guys, in fact. But that's all we've got for part 1 of Book 8. And so, please listen, please share, please like, and please call in if you ever have any questions. And so, have a wonderful day. Welcome back to the Alexander Schmid podcast. This is episode 028, Homer's Iliad, Book 8, Part 2. Last time we talked about the beginning of Book 8, Zeus and his golden rope and what that could possibly mean, and the claim that he made that were he to drop the rope down and all the other gods were to grab it from him, or try to grab it, and they tried to pull him, well, he wouldn't move an inch. But if he were to pull, it would pull them and the earth and the sea up, and thus chaos would replace order. And therefore, battle breaks out. And so death, or rather Zeus, then again, he gets a lot of action in this book. He pulls out his golden scales, and the death day of the Achaeans hangs heavier, and so they're going to experience their first loss today. And in fact, Zeus is going to bring up later in an argument with Hera that they're going to do a whole lot more losing tomorrow, too, just to make her mad. And so, the Achaean champions scatter. Remember Idomeneus, the Iontes, Odysseus too. Nestor has his horse brained by an arrow of Paris, Alexandros. And then Diomedes picks him up and then makes an attempt on the life of Hector and kills Hector's charioteer, Aeneas, instead. In fact, one of Hector's charioteers will be killed again today, his new one, Archeptolemus, and will be replaced with Cabriones. And so, to be Hector's charioteer is something of a funny motif in this book, something like being Kenny from South Park. And so, we'll see that rotating cast of clowns. And so, Diomedes attempts to kill Hector, comes close, doesn't quite get there. We said that indicates that his aim is improving as a leader. And in fact, or rather, his status is improving as a leader due to his increased capabilities and therefore his increased or improved and augmented goals, particularly attempting to kill the champion of Troy, which is an Achillean level goal, and an Aias level goal. But now Diomedes believes it's his level goal. And in fact, when Hector gives a rousing speech to the Trojans later on tonight, a victory speech, essentially perhaps the first victory speech they've had, he will mention Diomedes by name as the man that he wishes to kill. Not Aias, not Achilles, but Diomedes, the son of Tydeus. And so, remarkable for Diomedes. And so as the battle goes on, Hera attempts to persuade Poseidon to help her. He says flat no. Agamemnon then speaks from place of emotion, which makes Zeus, again, getting so much action in this book, nod his head in assent, which means that the men then approve of that which is said by Agamemnon and fight all the harder, even though they're going to have to mount a retreat as a loss. It's a graceful loss as far as Agamemnon is concerned. He's becoming the leader he ought to have been when Achilles was with him, but now, as necessity clangs at the door, he is improving, he is rising to the moment. And so, Agamemnon then recognizes some legitimate competence, because Teukros takes out 8 individuals, and I think I read their names off to you, and he will actually confirm later on in speaking to Agamemnon that it is 8 men that he killed. Agamemnon speaks from, he recognizes the legitimate competence of Teukros, and says, Teukros, I'll give you all these great gifts if we get out of this. And Teukros says, do I look like I need encouragement? But he doesn't say it quite with that connotation. He says, does it look, more like, I'm killing it, Agamemnon. Don't worry about me. And so, Teukros strains then to attempt to kill Hector, and in attempting to kill Hector, he shoots and kills his charioteer, his second charioteer, Archeptolemus. Remember, Aeneas was the first one. And Hector is saddened by this, but he's got to be getting used to it by now. And so his third charioteer takes Mount Cabriones, and as Hector goes by Teukros strains to kill him again, but Hector gets off a throw of a stone, and it's a nasty hit on Teukros. It hits him between the collarbone and the neck, which is that really soft part of your neck. Oh, ow. So, Teukros is messed up pretty bad. And so, not sure where I got cut off there, but Hector gets Teukros between the neck and the collarbone and the soft part of the neck, which is a very painful place to be hit by anything, especially a jagged rock. So Teukros goes down. Luckily, Aias the Greater is his brother or half brother. They're both sons of Telamon, of course. And so Zeus then fills the Trojans with fury, which means that they're going to start really feeling a strong drive towards success. They've got the spirit in them right now. And so Hector is wearing the eyes of the Gorgon. And what's the Gorgon? A Gorgon is a mythological creature. Medusa is one of the 3 Gorgons. She got her 2 sisters turned into them too. And they have snake heads, and they turn men to stone by means of looking at them, unless they can reflect the image of the Medusa or the Gorgon, and therefore it is inoculated, which is essentially what a teacher does with students by teaching them stories rather than taking them on to an actual battlefield where they would be traumatized. But because they know about the horrors of war and that which exists in the world, perhaps when real difficult and malevolent things happen, they will not experience trauma, which is why, of course, Perseus can see Medusa and defeat Medusa or nature with the work of art, the reflection of what is the shield, which is, of course, given to him by Athena. So what does it mean that Hector has the eyes of the Medusa or the eyes of the Gorgon right now? Well, the Gorgon represents nature and its ability to freeze one in his tracks. So Hector represents right now pure terror caused by full conscious realization of one's own mortality. And so, yeah, that's nature, and that's a very bad part of nature, and that's what everybody feels who sees Hector right now. So many Achaeans are fleeing, going back behind their wall. It's the first time they've ever had to do this. Usually the only times they would have gone behind their wall was to take dead men's armor back to fill their tents with, essentially. So, Hera attempts a second intervention. She now enlists the help of Athena, and this is a rare instance of disobedience on the part of Athena, and actually she's not going to get very far with it at all, indicating that she's not really actually planning to disobey Zeus, because the second he says no, she's going to jump right back to order, and so will Hera, too, frankly. So Hera and Athena get dressed up in their battle garb, and Homer takes some time to describe this, and Athena even mentions helping Heracles with Cerberus in the underworld. She gives this story. She says, I wish my father would remember when I helped him by helping his son. And Heracles, of all the mythological characters of old, is mentioned the most in the Iliad. He's brought up constantly. No other character from mythology is brought up as frequently as he is. And so this is what Athena says. Yet even this man would have his life and strength taken from him, dying under the hands of the Argives in his own country. But it is my father who is so furious in his heart of evil. He is hard and forever wicked. He crosses my high hopes, nor remembers at all those times I rescued his own son. Heracles, when the tasks of Eurystheus were too much for his strength. Those lines 358 to 362 or so, and in fact Eurystheus, we'll find out, is related to Heracles through Zeus, because Eurystheus and Heracles are both and why I laugh there is that Eurystheus is actually descended from Zeus as well. I believe is the great grandson of him, so he's actually cousin to Heracles. But Heracles, in fact, how it comes to be within the world of the Iliad that Heracles had to serve Eurystheus and do his 12 labors for him, which he's most famous for, is precisely due to the conniving of Hera against Zeus. And so, occasionally Hera will get Zeus back, and Heracles is often mentioned here. So, Athena makes mention of the fact that she helped him on one of those 12 labors, Cerberus, indicating that she was doing the will of Zeus at that time. But now she stands against Zeus, and she feels fairly uncomfortable with this position. But don't worry, it will soon resolve itself. So let's keep moving. The goddess's arm, and Zeus, seeing this from Mount Ida, where he frequently spends his time, sends Iris to stop them. And in fact, he gives her some fairly specific instructions. For one, she says, tell Athena, I'm very upset with her. But also, tell Hera, I'm not as upset with her, because I expect this sort of thing out of her. But, tell them if they get into that chariot and try and go down to the earth, I'll throw a thunderbolt at them, which they won't heal from for 10 years. And so Iris conveys that message down to Hera and Athena, essentially word for word. And something interesting about the messengers in the Iliad is that they do a very good job about quoting their lords word for word. And so one might say that this is due to a rhetorical trick for just simply remembering fewer words on the part of the poets, the rhapsodes who kept this poem. And that possibly, it may also be saying, however, that the servants did not feel at liberty to attempt to interpret their lord's will and would simply report it accurately down to the next lord and then do the same thing back. And in an age without smartphones and recording devices, that actually seems like a fairly likely explanation as well. So Iris lets these ladies know. And so Hera says, I can't go on. I can't keep fighting against Zeus. Athena, we can't stand up against him, which essentially affirms Zeus's claim from early in the book, at the beginning of book 8, that he's so strong that nobody could dare oppose him, even if everybody worked together to do it. And so what does it mean that Athena, if she is the will of Zeus, implemented in reality and generally through the form of Odysseus, what does it mean that she is currently sort of at odds with Zeus? Well, this might mean that Zeus is sort of at odds with himself, because he's the implement of fate. He does not necessarily determine fate, but he dispenses fate to others. He's a steward of fate. And so Troy is now fated to fall, but he loves Troy. They've never failed to sacrifice to him, which means they're great. And his favorite son of this generation, Heracles was his favorite son of the last generation, but I feel confident saying that Sarpedon is his favorite son in this generation. He loves him. He will cry blood tears and consider going against the gods and fate to save him in book 16. And so Zeus has nothing personal against Troy, and in fact has many reasons to bemoan its loss on a personal level. But he's had to put that aside as the king of the gods, because he always has to make the right choice. And so perhaps Athena is standing against her father right now in the same way that Zeus's personal consciousness as an anthropomorphized version of the dominance hierarchy, well, his personal consciousness is at odds with his more objective, kingly consciousness. And so he understands what he has to do as master of the universe, but it doesn't mean he has to enjoy it. So Hera and Athena retreat back to Olympus, and there's an extended description of the hours which comes from the word Horus, from which we get horosphere, meaning limit or limit sphere of limit, one might say, and or horoscope as well. And so the hours are the limits of our days. They are the definitions of our days. Definition as in definitum, to close off or to complete, to end, to bring framing and limit to. One might say that's what all rules and laws do. They tether us to some limit, which allows us some creative expression. Otherwise there would be nothing. Similar to the dichotomies we mentioned earlier last time between active forces and potential forces, in particular the active intellect of Aristotle, and how it acts as a stamp upon the potential intellect, much as the sun does so for the earth, as Dante says in his Paradiso, in the sphere of the sun. And so then we have a scene of Zeus arming his own chariot and coming down from Ida to Olympus to entertain himself amidst the other gods. And, well, what does he find most entertaining? Well, taunting his daughter and his wife sister. And in fact, one thing that he ends up saying to them, lines 8:55 to 56, is just a real threat. He says, "For I will say straight out," this is actually 4:54, "and it would now be a thing accomplished. Once hidden your car by the lightning stroke, you could never have come back to Olympus, where is the place of the immortals." So, he really lays into these ladies, saying, you almost messed up so bad. And so Hera responds, Athena is sullen and quiet, as his will. And Hera, though, she speaks against him, says, what sort of thing have you just said? We all know your strength, but yet, even so, we're sorrowful for the Danaan spearmen. We'll keep out of fighting, but we'll help them with good counsel. And of course, that's what is most important from those goddesses anyway, so they're still going to exercise influence in the most intelligent possible manner amongst the councils of their people. So this is not something that one ever sees Ares or Aphrodite vying for with gods. One only ever sees lobbying done by the Achaean gods. One does see complaining and whining, however, from Ares and Aphrodite after they're injured in Book 5, but that's hardly the same thing. So, one last thing that Zeus makes sure to say to Hera, just to really rub it in even more, and I'm thinking like rubbing something on an open wound, because it's nasty, as he says, the one thing though is that if you had a problem with how well Hector was doing today and how many Achaeans he was killing, yeah, well, he's going to do even better tomorrow. And so Zeus says, step aside, stand back, and just watch, because this is not going to be easy for you, nor is this going to be fun for you to watch. And there's nothing you can do. So perhaps he's sharing his own resentment at his own personal situation in this moment. Perhaps he's projecting his own situation onto her. Because what can he do against the impending fate of one of his favorite cities? His favorite city, he says, and his favorite son. And so the book closes with Hector giving a rousing victory speech, as I mentioned earlier, a victory speech in which he says, it was only the nightfall that kept him from burning the ships of the Achaeans after breaking down their wall. And so, it was okay though that night came, because it was time for the feasting of the Trojans. And he says that tomorrow, in a boastful way, he'll make an attempt on Diomedes. In fact, if I look at it right here, he says, now for the night, this is 5:29 to 5:35, we shall keep watch on ourselves, and tomorrow early, before dawn shows, shall arm ourselves in our weapons, and beside their hollow vessels, waken the bitter war god. And I shall know if the son of Tydeus, strong Diomedes, will force me back from the ships against the wall, or whether I shall cut him down with the bronze and take home the blooded war spoils. Tomorrow, he will learn his own strength, if he can stand up to my spear's advance. But sooner than this, I think in the foremost he will go down under the stroke, and many companions about him as the sun goes up into tomorrow. And so, that was actually the line 5:38. So he suggests a beautiful morning sunrise with its red hues augmented by the blood of his now enemy Diomedes. Enemy only in the sense that he's his target for glory, not enemy in any personal sense. So actually enemy is the wrong thing to say. He's not actually hostile to him in a personal way at all. He sees him more like a trophy and a potential trophy on his shelf. And so the book ends with a beautiful description of the Trojans were burning between the waters of Xanthos and the ships before Ilion. Blazing watchfires, 1,000 fires were burning there in the plain, and beside each one sat 50 men, so that's 50,000 men, in the flare of the blazing firelight, and standing each beside his chariot, champing white barley and oats. The horses waited for the dawn to mount to her high place. And so the book ends with night and with an impending dawn, and so something is going to begin tomorrow, and it's going to be a fight, and it's going to be a major fight. And in fact, in Book 9, we're going to see a major strategic move made out of desperation from the Achaeans. They're going to choose to send an embassy to Achilles and beg him to come back and offer him everything he wants, except for, well, what he truly wants, which is something he doesn't even know at this moment. He wants clarity, you might say. He can't get that from just receiving gifts back from Agamemnon, which does remind me of a quote that I heard once Alan Watts speak, which was about the Buddha. It was a story of the Buddha, and I thought it was beautiful. And perhaps it's appropriate here about the situation, or as a description, an analogical description of the situation between Achilles and his own destiny and Achilles and Agamemnon. And that's this. The Buddha was walking down a road one time, as he often did, alone. And he came upon a famous murderer. And the murderer, glad to be killing this man, but honoring a certain sacred code, said, "You may make one last request of me before I kill you. Pray." And so the Buddha said, "Okay, well, go over to that tree, please, and cut off a branch and bring it over here." And so the murderer, perhaps thinking this a fool, goes over to the tree, does so, cuts it off, brings it back to the Buddha and says, "Okay, well, there it is." And the Buddha says, okay, but this is a two-part request, actually. And the murderer says, "Okay." And the Buddha says, "Okay, now go reattach the branch." And supposedly in that moment, the murderer was converted and enlightened and saw the light. And so it's very easy to destroy things. But to put them back together again, that's true magic. That's truly divine, actually. And so this has been episode 27. Please share, like, subscribe, and have a great day!
The audio you just heard was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.